I had a very wonderful visit the last few years. Last year at the Shambhala Center was also a very nice visit. And it's always very enjoyable because even doing the introductions, I thought, among friends, it's a formality that's really not necessary. As I look around, I see so many familiar faces, students and practitioners from different sanghas. And then at the same time, Buddha Dharma is the unique ground upon which we all try to understand and practice. And so the Bay Area has always been very fortunate in having access to wonderful teachings and teachers and different lineages. So it's a very nice opportunity once in a year for someone like me to be able to come and meet friends. And then, since there has to be some sort of common ground upon our meeting on which we can meet, so Nagarjuna's letter is what Greg has asked me to go through. And so very, very happy to be able to come back this year. Very happy to meet Greg and many of the wonderful volunteers I hear who has supported him, worked with him in bringing this place together. And it's in such a beautiful place. I think less talking and just looking around Berkeley area probably is a much more enjoyable way. But since we are Buddhists and we should be more focused. So that's what I'm also very happy to do the Suhidalekha Shebetingik, as we say, or the Nagarjuna's letter to the friend. Earlier, as I said, the whole of this area is very fortunate in that I think there are as many Buddhist centers as there are any other, I think, different areas that one can go to. And that, I think, is very good. I've always hoped for more exchange between Sangha members of different lineages in the West, which is very important. Students all over the world within Buddha Dharma study well and practice very sincerely. East has always been very fortunate in having such a traditional approach to Dharma, 2,500 years in India, and the fortunate circumstances of all of us who are connected to that country in being able to retain and continually receive the Buddha's teachings in a way that has always been taught without the lineage ever being diluted or sort of disrupted in any way. So the purity of that lineage is there for anyone who is able to receive and practice it. Tibet has been exceptionally fortunate in 1,200 years of both the Sutra and the Tantra teachings. And innumerable, hundreds and thousands of great teachers and masters who have dedicated their life to not only their own practice, but in actually being able to preserve the teachings and expound the teachings, comment on the teachings, and making sure that the continuity is as pure as they have received it from their own teachers. So East has always been very, very fortunate in being supported with a very strong foundation of Buddha Dharma. The good side of it is that the growth and the continuity of the Dharma is still very strong. I think the downside is that the changes of the modern world and the East trying to keep up with the sort of economical development, as we call it, process often has distanced, I think, laymen from the Buddhist teachings a lot. Livelihood and survival, as well as the increase of material belongings, has become so very strong that oftentimes we find the seriousness with which Dharma is practiced is almost now relegated to just the monastic institutions. And so the monks and nuns are very fortunate in that they're still able to practice very diligently and sincerely. But the sort of development of Buddha Dharma as it has begun to happen now in the Western world, that is unfortunately not seen so much among the laymen or the common people of the Eastern world. And so, however, one of the marvelous things about Westernization of Buddhism is it has broken free from monastic institutions. And in this case, then monks and nuns become the second-class citizens, and the Dharma and the Sangha itself is held by lay people, lay practitioners, which is always, in all these now 21 years of my coming to the West, I'm still taking time to get used to just the idea of how much of Dharma and the foundation of Dharma is held by the Western practitioners. It's a wonderful thing to see. And in all these years, I would say one of the very wonderful characteristics of the Western Sangha is diligence. It's impossible, I think, for us to see examples of greater diligence and sincerity in approaching Buddha Dharma as we see in the West happening anywhere else in the world. And so your lifestyle, I've always pushed people into saying you have to practice completely. There is no half relationship you can have with the Dharma. I still stand by it, and I really think if you're a Buddhist, you should be a Buddhist completely. There can't be a sort of an armchair Buddhist or a half-time Buddhist or practicing Buddhism as a hobby or extracurricular activity. Buddhism is not to be approached in that way. It has to be a complete relationship, a complete full-fledged relationship. Having said so, however, I'm astounded oftentimes to think about the kind of lifestyles that you all have of really still, despite everything that is surrounding in your life, whether it is your family, whether it is your professions, whether it is your extra, many different things that you all keep busy with, especially in the West Coast area. The Californians are known to be busy in all kinds of ways. And Catherine, who was driving me this morning, was telling me about people saving trees by climbing on the trees and being there. And I told the two of the Tibetan nuns here, and we were all talking about how dedicated you'd have to be in the belief of saving trees to actually spend months on end on a tree. And then, of course, as Buddhists, we always say, I wish the Buddhist practitioners were just as dedicated to their meditation as these people are to trees. But nevertheless, there's all these many different things that you all do have, whether it is environment issues or whether it is learning extra languages or whether it is other skills that you are trying to understand or going back to school and continuing your education, which seems to be a very big thing in the Western world. Time, nevertheless, is divided into so many areas that require concentration and effort. And however, despite all this, how much people still make that sincere effort to Dharma and to practicing Dharma, and really not only practicing Dharma, but making it possible for others to practice and understand Dharma. So in that way, the diligence and the exertion that people put into the practice, the Western students put into practicing Buddha Dharma, that is, I think, exceptional, something that is extremely rare in today's world, as well as deeply inspiring for people like myself and all of us Easterners. And so I always go back to the East and I always say, Buddha Dharma is fast slipping from our hands into the hands of the Western students. And I say that in good hope. I say that with good aspiration. That having been said, then again increases your responsibility in now knowing that you have stepped into holding Dharma in your hands. And just as Shantideva says, precious jewel if it is maintained, knowing its value and its preciousness. As a precious stone is held by a person who knows the value of jewels. Then it is similar to the example of a jewel, a person who is knowledgeable about the value of jewels, being able to really understand the value of what he or she holds in one's hand. However, if a person who doesn't have an understanding of jewels, or a person who has no sight, chances upon a precious jewel, and yet assuming or thinking, guessing that it is just a rock in his hand, throws it away, discards it, then what a terrible waste of a precious jewel it is. In the same way, when we begin to approach Dharma, in the beginning knowing it to be very precious, but on the other hand, if the sort of the wave of our worldly affairs, samsaric tendencies, and the great storm of our own habitual tendencies overtake the awareness of what we hold as being precious, not recognizing its true value, then as a sightless person discards or throws away a precious jewel, likewise, it is quite possible that we may never really understand the value of what we hold. So when the preciousness of the content of what we hold isn't really deepened and understood more and more clearly, container in which it is held often becomes reluctant to holding it, or reluctant or unaware and careless of its value. And so that danger, I think, still persists. So the diligence and the exertion I always admire in the Western students. Little bit of carefulness, however, that needs to come about is that diligence and exertion of the effort must be directed in the correct way, so that it doesn't become just a sense of holding on to a rock, but that it is actually being able to each day deepen the understanding of the preciousness and the value of what you hold, so that the diligence and the exertion fruitions and genuinely results into becoming a fruition, a result that is of tremendous benefit to oneself and the others. It is with extraordinary amount of many, many years, many, many lifetimes, hard work that we come to a point in our life where we obtain this precious human existence, not only be born as human beings, but in this life encounter circumstances that lead us to actually meeting with Dharma and to be able to have the inspiration to practice the Dharma. Several hundreds of lifetimes of hard work and acquiring of great merit through generating lots of awareness and mindfulness, do we come across an opportunity, as we have in this lifetime, where the inspiration of having met with the Dharma lingers on into an inspiration to take that inspiration to action. And not only meeting with the Dharma, but to keep up a consistent approach to hearing the Dharma, reflecting the Dharma, contemplating the Dharma, putting the Dharma into action. And so it is not just accidentally. So many people, if they think that this is just by chance that you happen to meet with Dharma and that it's a very simple thing to do, often have, I think, a very limited understanding of how this is not true, but that it is with great effort, with great planning, with great aspiration, with great amount of effort, that you actually plan, and almost the word probably appropriate here would be strategize, to come to a point of life such as what you have today. Just at that moment where all circumstances have fully come into correct alignment, where it is fully, has now the full possibility of maturation into the desired fruition, one doubt, one hesitation, one reluctancy, one carelessness destroys all those innumerable lifetimes hard work that has to be understood by meditators as being a potential that you do have. So many teachings say, Khandro Rinpoche especially says, this life of a meditator, one who has a human body, met with the teachers and the teachings, and is sitting on the cushion, can be called crossroads. You are at that Bardo, that very border between now bringing it to full fruition or not, or completely dismantling every effort, every hard work that you have put into for innumerable lifetimes. And therefore, reflecting in this way, in the beginning, as, oh no, through all my efforts, through the efforts of many lifetimes, today when all the merits have come into fruition of this moment, of being a meditator with the ability to becoming a vehicle of liberation from suffering for myself and for all other sentient beings. When that opportunity is directly in front of me today, what do I do with that opportunity? Do I simply say, oh, it's perchance that I come across it, or that by accident I came into it, or that I simply ignore it, not recognizing its value, or really taking time and seeing something that is as inconsequential as, let's say, a cup of coffee, and you think, I've worked hard To earn this cup of coffee, I'm going to savor every taste, every gulp of coffee that I'm going to have, I'm going to savor its taste and enjoy it very much. And you take a sip and you make that extra effort to say, this is wonderful coffee. I'm going to like it very much. It's something that is really the result of my work. As insignificant as it might be, we still make that delight. We generate that delight of that sip of coffee. This is hundreds of lifetimes hard work, hundreds of lifetimes aspiration, and if not hundreds of lifetimes, this lifetime's hard work and aspiration, all the exertion that comes into being fruitioned in a moment of awareness, in a moment of being able to really resemble a human being as a human being should be, with the potential of what a human being should be, and therefore fully bringing it to fruition, having the possibility of that fruitioning to be good, a basis of goodness for yourself and for the others. Am I going to realize that value, that precious opportunity and utilize it or not? That contemplation, that research, that analysis must be held in the minds of all meditators in the beginning. It's never good to just rush into meditation. Never good to simply think a little bit about Dharma or to do a little bit of practice. But prior to listening, prior to studying, prior to sitting, or prior to any practicing, really building up a sense of awareness of the value of what you have actually gotten, an opportunity that you have at this moment, and then to be, as we say, as an example, to be on the driver's seat or to be the skillful rider so that you can take the vehicle to the direction that you really want it to go. And in this way, realizing the fruitioning of every effort that you have put in this moment, and therefore, from this moment, where are you going to take this fruitioning time? Where are you going to take your life? Where are you going to take this moment? Where are you going to take this understanding and develop into what? Develop into what that would be the best fruitioning, best result for yourself and for the others. And so if a person can really look into one's own mind, thinking in this way, and then realizing the value, the preciousness of having been able to understand Dharma, and this Dharma that you now have, how are you going to use it to the best potential as a source of real relief from suffering for yourself and the others? What could you do? Then that is having eyes, as we say, giving eyes or giving sight to the person who is beginning to walk a journey. If the eyes of the person are missing, you may walk around a lot, but all that one may be doing is circulating, sort of going around in circles, never finding your way out. But that deep contemplation of, yes, this is Dharma, what am I going to actually do about it? How am I going to actually bring it now into a fruition that would have the best result for myself and the others, is giving sight to the path and to the journey that you are now embarking upon. This sight often is therefore in all the texts, especially in all the Mahayana texts, called intention. Intention and motivation are which gives direction to the journey that you are walking upon. So if the intention is researched in your own mind through contemplation, that is the most superior. If, again, caught up by one's own laziness, then we simply generate an intention that is the best intention being generated by others, which is called Bodhichitta. So most of the teachers will say before a session, generate the right intention of Bodhichitta for all sentient beings. Everything is contained within such an instruction, but oftentimes it has been seen as we assume we have Bodhichitta. Oh yes, I'm going to generate Bodhichitta for all sentient beings, and having no idea what Bodhichitta actually is, or having a vague idea of what Bodhichitta is. And in our minds, I don't know whether you do it, but I used to always do that. It was whatever Shantideva thought, that one. Or whatever Asanga thought, that one. Or whatever Bodhichitta means best, that one. Sort of just that one, and never really pushing yourself into generating a little more effort into thinking, what is it that you're supposed to be doing? Now, in this context, as I said, generating the right intention, being able to think, and then again, if it is only so much that we can do, then generating the aspiration and saying something like, as the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas have generated the enlightened mind of compassion, may my mind also follow their example and generate good intention. But there is this very simple thing that we have just said about giving eyes to the journey that you are walking upon. If you're traveling somewhere, it's of course very useful to have a pair of good eyes so that you know where you are walking. It's very clear what your journey is going to look like. Nagarjuna's letter to the friend, as a text, I've often felt, is like the eyes, to giving eyes to the path that we are walking upon. As a text in the Buddhist and the Indian, Tibetan Buddhist and the Indian Buddhist tradition, there are many, many, countless of wonderful texts. Some texts, now I think just speaking freely here, in my own opinion, my teachers would often scold us very much if we even said something similar to it. But now, as Greg said, most of them are passed away, so I'll simply sort of, although their presence is always often felt, but I'll sort of take it my sort of freedom to do that is, you know, some texts are exceptionally poetic, very beautiful. Some texts are not poetic. They are very dry in many ways. Each of them have their own benefits. If you speak about why they are so, then there's a reason behind it. As the real basis of the structure in which it is presented, it is often said there are as many vehicles or levels of teachings as there are individuals. So although we say there is Hinayana teachings, Mahayana teachings, Vajrayana teachings, nevertheless, we can say these are just very general ways of classifying levels of Dharma and the meaning of the Dharma as it is presented. But that individually, if we would say, or if being particular, as someone asked, how many different types of levels are there in Buddha Dharma? The correct answer would be as many as there are individuals that are practicing and hearing the Dharma. Dharma has to be taught according to the potential of the person that might best enable the person to click in with what is being said so that the certainty and the confidence of the view becomes undiluted and absolutely pure, and the purity is retained in the mind of the person. So in that context, different styles cater to different potentials. Some people are very scholastic and find greater inspiration in just very direct teachings. Many, many great masters, often, although very learned and skilled in poetry, nevertheless have taught in language that is what we call common people's language, without it being poetic, without it being beautiful, but very stark, very direct, very, very colloquial in many ways. Some teachers have taught in languages that are so beautiful, poetic, and again it inspires that group of people who best get inspiration from the poetry, from the beauty of what is being expressed. Some teachers explain in very complicated methods. Each sentence is like a code that you have to break. Complex, difficult. As I grew up studying some of the texts, I wondered whether they wanted us to learn anything or not out of it. Is that it would take years and years trying to actually understand. 2 days ago, I received a message from one of the scholars in the Tokyo University saying, well, these were the few texts that he had not received from His Holiness, and he was having trouble understanding what it meant, and he mentioned a text. And he said, when you're coming here, if we could go through the text. And I was thinking about it the other day, and I thought, he's asking the wrong person. That kind of a text is something that I would never even imagine myself trying to understand what it is. You look through a sentence and you have a vague idea what they're talking about, but each word can be a volume of teachings. And therefore, Dharma has been taught and sort of approached by these great masters and scholars in all these diverse ways to tame the minds that are diverse with different levels, different potentials. And so, in general categorization, however, I would say there are teachings that are rather indirect, very beautiful, very indirect. I personally call them teachings that are almost non-threatening. And these are what Western students have always loved very much, as a sort of non-threatening. This is a very, very beautiful, sort of very true, very inspiring, but very accommodating to a pace. There are several teachings that do not do that. And they're very threatening especially if you have resistance. If you're wanting to go on a journey, but you would like to have a sort of a nice walk, you're not really getting there. You're in no hurry to get there, and you don't want to know everything that you need to do. And so you think it stems or sort of pulls you back from being free to sort of keep a little bit of exploration or adventure spirit off. So those are very essential pithy instructions, texts that do not allow meditators to compromise the teachings at all. So the teachers almost have a sense of being at your throat. Either do it or be aware that you are not a practitioner at all, kind of a teaching. Nagarjuna's letter to a friend, I think, is like that. One is, although the 123 verses I think it has are very poetic in its own way, but on the other hand, you have to keep in mind it's a letter. So the way it is written is you'll have to keep in mind exactly what you do when you write a letter. If you have a very profound experience of some kind, and you're talking about, let's say, your own wedding, you're writing about it to somebody, or you're writing about a wedding of your own child, or brother or sister or a friend to somebody else, and you try very much to bring about as, evoking as the letter can be, yet because it's a written format, especially in the olden days when you had to actually write it with a bamboo pen, let's say, you would have to limit how more descriptive you would be. You would have to delete a lot of the flowery things to get in as much content as possible. So therefore, the structure of the text itself is very letter-oriented. And as you would write a letter of advice to your own friend, and therefore you would not say so much about why you need to do so many things, but you would say, better do these things. You need to do these things. I thought of these things that you need to do, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, do them. And then thinking you have some time in the future, if the person replies back to you, you've told me to do these 5 things, why? Then that you would in the future have the opportunity. There are 2 options. And it says one option is you would hope that the person has enough knowledge to know why they have to do it. Yeah. And the second is if you do get a response back saying why, you would have an opportunity to elaborate upon it. So Nagarjuna's letter has a lot of very direct instructions. Without beating around the bush, they go very directly into saying, do them, apply them. One reason is given is the letter was written to his friend, King Dezangpo, as we say. And Dezangpo himself, the king, is said to have been a very learned person, a very good practitioner, someone who had studied the works and the teachings of the Buddha, and therefore was a knowledgeable person who simply had to be reminded more of bringing about honesty and a genuine, pure approach to the practice of the Dharma. So it's quite similar. Therefore, it's also considered an exceptional Mahayana text for people who are already practicing the Dharma, is that we've heard about these things, but the letter of Nagarjuna reminds the meditator to come back, just in case in the journey we've sidestepped certain issues, we've compromised on certain things. So in the same way that it would bring the king back into the understanding, likewise, it would allow the meditator to also come back into a much more poignant and a direct awareness to our own journey in realizing the freedom and gaining the freedom from suffering of self and other sentient beings. And the second, of course, is then sort of given to teachers who comment upon the teaching to elaborate reasons of why such practices should be practiced. And so the root verses, therefore, over the ages have been commented upon by various great teachers, commentaries according to the environment and the students to whom the teachings have been given, as to the sort of elaboration on the instructions of Nagarjuna to King Dezangpo is the Tibetan name. Surabhi Bhadra is the Sanskrit name of the king. And therefore, the teachings have been considered always very much the fundamental root teachings of the Mahayana form of instructions. Nagarjuna now, of course, is one of the greatest masters, scholars, and also sometimes we refer to him as the second Buddha of the Buddha Dharma, of the Buddhist traditions. Most of you are familiar with Nagarjuna. And I think Buddhism wouldn't have been today what Buddhism is. Especially Tibetan Buddhism wouldn't be Buddhism at all if it was not the efforts of Nagarjuna himself. Born in south of India into a Brahmin family, he grew up, and historians have various dates, so I'm not sure about how it is. His lifespan itself has been said by some to be 400 years. Some say he lived up to 600 years. I don't know how they calculated that. But most of them do agree that he grew up and became a monk, receiving ordination from Mahasiddha Saraha, and became the abbot of Nalanda University. What is very important for us Buddhists to know is that the expounding of the Buddha's teachings that branched off into the tradition of Sutra and Tantra wouldn't have been possible without Nagarjuna's efforts. And so Buddha was born in the 5th century, then he expounded the teachings, turning the wheel of the Dharma one time, second time, third time. And so again, the historians have a way of saying he turned the wheel of Dharma 3 times. Yeah. But at the same time, it is, some say that's a wrong way to say it. He never turned the wheel 3 times. He did it only once. Now, I just came in from Virginia, where we have a great historian, and I think many of you are very familiar with her work. Rita Gross is a great historian, a Buddhist scholar, and a very strong Hinayanist. And so she is very educated in teaching about history of Buddhism. And her history of Buddhism, because she's a historian, she tries to stick very much to exact dates and exact eras and so on and so forth. And it doesn't work very well with we Vajrayanist Buddhists who are sort of going to say something like Nagarjuna lived 600 years. Doesn't matter how you calculate it. Just imagine him living 600 years or so. If you have difficulty with it, he lived 50 years. It doesn't matter to us if you say 50 years. And so for the historians, it's an impossible thing to do. So she and I have been very good friends, but this is one thing that we have great fun with. And because I sit on a throne and she sits down there, poor thing, she can't argue with me too much. But I'm very much appreciative of how hard they do work. Now, why I'm mentioning her is because of being sort of the Hinayanists often will say Buddha taught a teaching. He taught the Four Noble Truths, he taught the Eightfold Path, he taught the 12 Nidanas. Shravakas and the Pratyakas who become the Arhats are the true adherers of Buddha Dharma. From Mahayanists and the Vajrayanists' perspective, there is no argument about it at all. We agree that is very true. And being Arhats, they adhere. They listen to the sutra teachings of the Buddha. They adhere to the Vinaya traditions. There are Abhidharma teachings that the Buddha gave upon the truth of self and truth of the phenomena, particularly the truth of self. And therefore, through that adherence of the teachings, they are exemplary practitioners and meditators. However, within the larger context of the teachings, we say Buddha lived up to an age of 80 years, and he taught throughout his life. We're not saying he taught 3 times, first turning, second turning, and the third turning, but that all of his teachings for the welfare of people who need to categorize their teachings according to subject matters, there are 3 particulars that the Buddha taught. Buddha presented the truth. He further elaborated what the truth was by expounding the teaching on emptiness, and then further elaborated on emptiness by turning the third wheel of the Dharma, teaching about absolute luminous nature of emptiness. That emptiness is not total void, but the truth of emptiness is that it is an indivisibleness of the two truth, or indivisibleness of the emptiness and luminosity. Whichever way, emptiness and luminosity is much more a Tantra approach of expression. And the indivisible of the two truth is much more a Mahayanist way of saying what the third turning of the wheel of Dharma of the Buddha is. Then Buddha passed away after the age of 80. Historians, some say 80, some say 81. He passed away. And then for a few years, of course, as is always the case, such as you and I, whenever our teachers are alive, we study with them. When our teachers pass, there are 2 or 3 months of very good behavior, and then we come back to our own habits, isn't it? In the same way, nothing is different as today. It was 2,500 years ago, and great amount of schisms began to arise within the spiritual community during that time. So historically, we have mention of councils, of many different councils or meetings of the elders, meetings of the learned scholars, where they tried to bring about more peacefulness and harmony and non-schism in the communities by compiling the works of the Buddha with accurate details, so that various versions didn't happen. And so it's very easy. You teach a certain teaching to 10 students, 10 students will have 10 versions of that teaching, isn't it? And then it's all very fine if they all agree the diversity, but whenever someone says mine is better than yours, that is what creates the schism always. And so it happened, and after about 100 years of Buddha's parinirvana, a lot of schism began to arise, and therefore, no matter how many councils were brought forward, and the Buddha's teachings were then first recorded as Tripitaka, or the 3 baskets of teaching, enumerating them as sutra teachings, which are oral transmissions of the Buddha's words, Vinaya, the teachings all on disciplines or ethics, teachings that the Buddha gave, particular to the subject of discipline and ethical conduct, and Abhidhamma teachings, which are Buddha's teachings mainly on analysis, logic, reasoning, and sort of what we call science of mind teachings. So the councils and the great elders, the arahats and the many bodhisattvas, brought the teachings of the Buddha and compiled them into 3 mainstreams. However, Abhidhamma continued to be taught, Sutra continued to be taught, Vinaya continued to be taught and practiced, and at the same time, variations of many kinds arose. Particular variation arose when it came to view of Buddha Dharma. Among Buddhists, for example, if we all are together, not many of us ask each other, what's your view? It's something that you can commonly experience among yourselves. As Buddhists, there is an unspoken sort of a supposition that we all know what the view is. There's no reason to ask this question. But as soon as you go outside, somebody will say, so what does a Buddhist believe in? And then you have to find an answer, isn't it? What does a Buddhist believe in? And if you're in a hurry, as many people ask me sometimes, if you're in a hurry, I've always found myself to give up some very easy answer. Buddhists believe in compassion. Buddhists believe in karma. And then if it's another Buddhist, Buddhists believe in emptiness. The emptiness is not totally emptiness, it's emptiness luminosity. Buddhists believe in the indivisibility of the two truth, isn't it? Or some other smart answers that we can come up with, whatever different things. But the actual fact of the matter is, do we actually know what the view is in our own minds? And in that same context, the sort of fractions or misunderstandings, as well as varieties of views, began to be expressed as being Buddhist views. When that situation arose almost 300 and especially 400 years after the Buddha's parinirvana, it became completely necessary for scholars and great teachers who really had worked in understanding the Buddha's teachings to compile together what is the Buddhist view. Therefore, great universities came into being, most prominent in this regard being Nalanda University. Nalanda University gained its prominence for its absolute, undiluted research on the Tripitakas, Sutra, Vinaya, and Abhidharma, and the essence of that research and studies by the masters and scholars, not only learned in the subject, but living it and realizing it completely. Not like, I think, scholars like ourselves, or these days what we have here is someone who is very clever and understanding of the subject matter, but not necessarily living what you're teaching. In the times of Nalanda, all of these great scholars were exceptional practitioners, realized enlightened bodhisattvas themselves, who not only learned and understood a subject matter, but actually emulated it completely in the actions of their body, speech, and mind. Such Mahabodhisattva scholars, and exceptional among them, became Nagarjuna. Therefore, he became the principal, or the main abbot, or the principal of Nalanda University. And in his lifetime, the whole effort was in understanding the subject of all the teachings of Buddha, and then compiling it in accordance to the view that was presented. And therefore, we find the growth of a system called Mahayana view developing from the works and the activities, the teachings, and the understanding of Nagarjuna. Therefore, Nagarjuna is also called the father of Mahayana Buddhism. He is also called the first one who actually expounded on the Prajnaparamita Sutra, giving way to today what we then have as the Madhyamika stream of teachings. And so today what we have as Buddhism is definitely then sort of connected to the first Buddha, of course, his teachings being the foundation, the basis, but then Nagarjuna's efforts. And then through his, of course, great other masters, Pamasambhava came from Nalanda, Asanga, Shantarakshita, Shantideva, all of these great Prahivajra, all of these great masters who evolved from them, however, adhere to the system of approach of studies as what Nagarjuna himself taught. And so from Nalanda, then we have a much more clearer understanding of then the system called Hinayana approach, Mahayana approach. Tantra also evolved from there, spreading later on into Tibet. And then it became one of the great sort of central bodies through which the teachings today have evolved. So today, modern day, when we say Buddhism, and the Buddhism that we know about couldn't have evolved as it is in such a systematic way, clearly sort of classified, clearly divided into different sections, a very orderly approach of the teachings. This kind of a thing couldn't have happened without Nagarjuna's efforts at all. And so during the time of Buddha himself, he was this exceptional, enlightened, very kind teacher, and he taught. His own wisdom and his own compassion and his activity was such that his direct approach to the teachings touched the hearts of thousands of his disciples who studied. But as it often happens is, when you live with a teacher, you take things for granted. Everything is a little bit abstract. And therefore, that abstractness often is very good during the time of the teacher. But when the teacher, the central point where everyone agrees with, is out of the picture, then the cohesiveness doesn't rest. And so for Buddha Dharma today to be very cohesive, very structured, very, very sort of clear definitions, very clear demarcations, clear levels that are outlined, all of these scholastic approaches and the shape and the framework that the Buddha Dharma has today is then said to be through the efforts of Nagarjuna himself. Nagarjuna's whole lifetime, however way you may calculate now, was dedicated to teaching, compiling, expounding the teachings. In general, they are collected into 4 parts, and they're called Nagarjuna's 4 collections. First one is called Tamtsok. In Tibetan, we say Tamtsok, which are collection of stories or anecdotes. Very, very important subject matters. Now, although we are doing this because last year during a course of conversation with Greg Eller, I had said it's always very nice to keep an environment very informal. And so I'll say a few things. At any time you want me to stop or have a question or whatever it is, just raise your hands, okay? Keeping it very informal. It's always, I thought, very unfortunate that today's style of teachings, teacher talks, you write a few things, and then that's the end of it. So much is lost in that. You have to argue with the teacher, you have to ask questions, you have to say something, then have a dialogue, a conversation. I'm very hopeful that the West can slowly begin to learn that tradition of having 15 minutes of teaching and then 2-3 hours of conversation on that subject matter. That's the way to learn Buddha Dharma. Then today it's very different. Sometimes I think, what are we doing? Talk. I especially, do this the whole day, I think whole year. And so every day, 2-3 hours of my saying something, and sometimes I think, what do they hear? How much do they hear? And what do you do after what you've heard? This is sort of not such a good thing. It's good in some occasions. Now, having said that, there have been certain places where I've said it and then suddenly everybody raises their hands and we can never finish a subject matter at all, and then the conversation goes on. But I think it's very important to have discussion. Our mode of training is based upon discussion and answering your questions and being able to question it without hesitation, because it's all about working with your mind. Buddhism cannot be taught by rubbing you with Buddhism every day. You have to be able to understand it. And so stop me, ask questions whenever you feel like, okay? Now, Nagarjuna's works, the first one being the collection of anecdotes, or also called collection of stories, very important subject matter. For you who are studying, all of you who are studying Buddha Dharma, always keep in mind why we enumerate these things, why we mention these things is for you to understand the world of Buddha Dharma. If you don't understand Buddha Dharma's world itself, you get into an idea where you relate to Buddha Dharma as a religion. There is no harm in relating to Buddha Dharma as a religion if that is what is most helpful to you. Many people do. But on the other hand, as I said, if you believe in Buddha Dharma and you think that that is sufficient, then it won't work. Buddha Dharma is something that you have to believe in. But that belief should never be coming from somebody else telling you it's worth believing. You have to always make sure that the belief is based upon reasoning and your research. And a belief cannot be called a belief until it becomes certainty. And certainty can never be poured into the hearts of another person. It has to be developed through research and analysis and questioning until it becomes a certainty. However, if the certainty arises, that certainty is useless until it is then manifest in your attitude and in your conduct. Therefore, if you take these 4 steps, you really have to sort of hear it, some sense, or we call it belief, but it must make some sense to you. That making sense to you must be researched until it becomes certainty, and then the certainty must manifest. If it is manifesting in your attitude and your conduct, then that can be called believing in Buddhism. If it is not manifest in your attitude and conduct, no matter how much you say you love Buddhism or you believe in Buddhism to be true, it's always debatable. In order now, however, that it becomes a confident certainty that is manifest in your attitude and your conduct, you have to really put in the effort to reasoning, to analysis, to examining, to checking it in your own mind whether it is true or not, to really develop that belief into a certainty. And in order to be able to do that, you have to hear many things, you have to research, you have to listen, you have to study, you have to really go through the whole process, the processing part of it. And in order to process it, you have to have the help of many different approaches. One of the very careful approaches, or the very helpful approaches, is called anecdotes and stories. Therefore, biographies of great teachers, the various anecdotes, the various stories, the historical accounts of Buddha Dharma forms a very integral, very important subject matter, gives you an idea and inspires your research and your reasoning. It gives you a framework and a support, a guidance to really be able to go through the processing so that the belief becomes a certainty in your own mind. Therefore, a large part of Nagarjuna's work is then categorized as collection of stories. And then if you have time and the effort, you must research these classical texts and study them. They are very helpful to you. Second is called Rikthok, collection of reasonings. These are exceptional groups of instructions or teachings, collected works of Nagarjuna based on the subject matter of Madhyamika reasoning, logic, analysis, all the subjects that stem from the fundamental teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha's 12 Nidanas, the 12 interdependent origination, leading to then the understanding of the emptiness of phenomena and emptiness of self. Third group of work is called Dezangpo, collection of praises. And so all the praises, or the great amount of compositions of his works that are there, that are connected to praises of the three jewels, the praises of the Mahabodhisattvas, the praises of the path of the practice, and praises of the absolute truth. And in those praises, being able to really give us a very clear understanding of realizing the value of what we hold. And so until we are aware of the qualities and the characteristics that are truly pure and beneficial for oneself and the others, we do not treasure, we do not know the value of what we hold. So the collection of praises shouldn't be regarded as just poetic expressions of praises, but those that guide the mind into understanding what it is that we hold. It's like giving a diamond to a person and then talking about carats and clarity and all the what different kinds of qualities of the precious jewel are. In the same way, then the person says, oh, what I hold is truly, really brilliant. It is really very clear. It is really very pure. It is really valuable. Praises are that allows the illumination of the mind of the meditator to recognizing the qualities of one's own self as the qualities of the path of practice and so forth. More Vajrayana sort of terms, Tathagata Garba or Sugata Garba or Rigpa, these are then what is then sort of the main subject matter of his teachings, and therefore collection of suchness. These are four major teachings grouped together in different collections of Nagarjuna. So when we say, what are the works of Nagarjuna, then for a Buddhist to have the answers as these are the four collections would be a much more accurate way of saying, because lots of people simply say, oh, Nagarjuna was a very great learned scholar. What did he do? And then we don't have any further information. So we may say something about, well, he taught the Madhyamika, or he taught the Prajnaparamita, or the Mula Madhyamika Karika, which is the main Madhyamika text, is what he expounded upon. But it's also good to know that he did expound on all these four different kinds of collections, and these four collections are the gathering of all his teachings. Yes, very good.
I have a question in regards to the first path, when you have stories and anecdotes. I have a question in regards to the first path when you talk about stories and anecdotes. When you have reoccurring dreams about animals, would that be considered a story?
No, not in this context.
Okay.
Not in this context. Dreams that we have, we could say it's your story, right? And in that context, it's a story. This particular story that it's a very good question because it clarifies what we're talking about. This particular story are almost biographical accounts. So it's probably it's good, as I said, if you ask questions, because then we can correct the way we say things. And so when we say stories, for a Tibetan, biography is stories. For you, it may not be. Stories are fables, and then there are sort of accurate stories which are biographical accounts and so forth. So that's, I think, clearly should be understood. These are collections of biographical accounts, let's say. Anecdotes and biographical accounts. Yes. Behind here.
Would you say that like the songs of Milarepa in praises are in that category?
The songs of Milarepa itself, again, has further categorizations. And they are categorized according to their own specific subject matters that they have in them. They may be categorized as subjects relating to the nature of mind. There are a collection of songs that are connected to the essence of Mahamudra being presented, collection of songs that are mainly poignantly pointing out to renunciation, collection of songs for mainly to understand the preciousness of human existence. So they are grouped according to their own. In a general categorization, songs of Milarepa would be, I would say, much more connected to the nature of suchness, because there's so much direct transmissions given in them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So then is it more like Angulimala's story where you can say, wow.
Very correct.
They can turn their life around, I can do it too.
No. Yes, I think that's a very accurate way of saying it, is that within Nagarjuna's letter, several stories are mentioned, such as Angulimala's story is mentioned at some point. And so you hear about Angulimala, or any of the Uddiyana is one, Ajat Shatru is another story that is there. And so these stories inspire the person to say there are living examples of people who've done this, and therefore I should not be discouraged. And so those are a collection of stories. That's good. And they are biographical accounts also. So they're not something that Nagarjuna came up with, and it's not a fictional, I think you call it fiction, isn't it? Yes, fictional. Yes. I think they would like you to wait for the microphone. Yes.
Were Nagarjuna and Shantideva at Nalanda at the same time?
Around the same time, yes. Now, historians may have, more sort of saying, well, there is about 200 years difference between the two. But if Nagarjuna lived 600 years, I think he met a lot of people during that time. But in the terms of lineage, Asanga and Shantideva, all of them are enumerated after the example of Nagarjuna. Okay? I was thinking this morning, I said, I'll have to tell these people he lived 600 years. So that, so he met, must have met a lot of people. And then I was thinking, well, he must have met right down to Milarepa and so on and so forth, down into the 10th and 11th century. But also, again, to this effect, how you count it is in different ways. Traditionally, scholars also had a way of counting day and night as two different ways of counting. Some calculated 1 quarter of a day as 1 year. So they divided 6 hours into what was enumerated as a single day. So there are different versions. Some scholars say 600 years therefore can be close to 100 years in dividing all of them into 6 parts, 4 hours of each. So 24 hours broken into 6 parts of 4 hours each, and then counted. In our meditation, we often say keep 6 sessions. That is 4 hours, 6 sessions, 24. 6 was 24 hours. And so 6 sessions, when we maintain, there is a whole way of saying, in these 4 hours, going through all the nidanas, or in these 4 hours, being able to really see birth and death, being able to contemplate on impermanence. And so going through a whole circulation of cyclic existence within the 4 hours. So in that context, if you take, then also one way of looking at it is that live close to 100 years. I don't know whether that is the way they would calculate this. For example, Padmasambhava is said to have lived 900 years, still living, isn't it? Okay, so, yes.
Thank you, Jetsun Khandro. How would you characterize the story of the Naga king? I had always heard that Nagarjuna basically received his information from this kind of enlightened sea serpent.
In the history, yes, that's another one. In the context of the Buddhist belief, all forms of life are respected. And it is said that it is too many to enumerate all the diverse kinds of lifestyles, life forms. But there are ways where we say 3 kinds of forms: desire realm, form realm beings, and formless realm beings. These are the general categorizations. Human beings like ourselves who are driven by desire and grasping as the main characteristic are called individuals existing in the desire realm. Form realm beings are then given as those beings often called devas or celestial beings. Beings who are possibly existent with some kind of form, not necessarily tangible form like ours, but some kind of form. And then the third categorization is formless beings, beings who have some subtle consciousness but may not have necessarily forms at all, in the form of spirit, let's say. Those are general categorizations. And then among those, then there are many more that are classified. There are the 8 classes of spirits, for example, that are classified. And we talk about power of protectors, for example, land protectors. If you look at the culture of Tibetans as well as many Eastern cultures, even in India, for example, in the West you have the Aboriginals, you have the Native Americans, and in Africa you have many such traditions which have a very strong awareness of there being energies, some call it energies, some call it spirits, but a form of there being a vibrancy, an energy of vibrancy in certain consistencies. And so in the Buddhist language, we simply sort of call them protectors, or we call them land protectors or spirits in those cases. Now in that enumeration, there is the whole enumeration of a class of beings called the Nagas. And from a very loose perspective, people seem to sort of connect them to snakes or the reptile family or sort of the power of the water element, particularly land and water elements. But Nagas have to be more essentially understood as beings who are born with a certain kind of a karma to be able to be more attached to that kind of an environment which has more water element to it. That they're always in the water, that's not necessary. They can be on the land too. But by attachment, by their connection, they are more sort of connected to the water element very strongly. Nagarjuna, the name itself, comes from 2 terms, Naga and Arjuna. Arjun was one of the most well-known Indian warriors skilled in archery. And it is said whenever he let loose an arrow, it never missed the target. And therefore, a variation of that name was made to Nagarjuna himself, saying his words always struck the view, or they struck the point in the heart of the person, as did Arjuna's arrow that always struck the target. Naga, this first term comes because his whole life is particularly directed to that moment where it is said he went to the kingdom of the Nagas, and from there actually got the true sutra teachings, the teachings of the Buddha that he gave especially on Prajnaparamita, and brought it back. During the time of the Buddha, it is said Buddha could speak to all beings, all forms of beings, that all sentient beings understood him. Now that's actually very, very, very true in many ways. There have been certain instances that I can probably mention that will be easier for you to understand. When we say in the very older classical text, it is said when the Buddha spoke, he spoke a language that could be understood by everyone. Humans could understand it in human languages of different kinds. Animals could understand it in their language. The devas could understand in their language. The Nagas could understand in their language, and so forth. Now, I grew up also thinking, how does that work? But what I find is, in my own experience, our teachers, for example, I often say, talk about this, is I spend every day of my life talking about texts to people. And most oftentimes, I find sometimes that going through the same text again and again with a student, they seem to get something, but not always get everything, sort of get as much as we would like them to get. So they're sort of, if you ask them, what did I teach you yesterday? They look at you and then sort of blank out completely, isn't it? Sort of not really knowing something. And you work with these students for years and years, saying the same thing again and again, again and again, again and again. You should let go because it is emptiness. You should let go because it is impermanent. You should let go because this doesn't work. You should let go. Through the 12 nidanas, you explain to them. Through the truth of suffering, you try to explain to them. Through the truth of emptiness, you try to explain to them. Try to explain them by giving them methods of meditation to do. You try to explain to them by doing all kinds of things. And they all will come up with, yes, we should let go, but how and why? It's a kind of little bit. Then occasionally, I've often noticed is that then there are certain moments when we allow them to go and get a blessing from our teachers. His Holiness, my father, for example, in his later years, he was very ill, so he was unable to speak for several years to people. And yet at the sometimes on those very rare occasions that he would bless the people, we would take these people, and because he was unwell, I remember saying to the students, you're not allowed to ask him a question. So we coach them before they go. You're not allowed to ask them a question. You go in, whether he gives you a hand blessing or not, just move out. And then we teach them in so many ways. They are scared to go in the first place, isn't it? And then when they are rushed in, there are all these attendants who will sort of pick them from one place, bonk their head, and shove them out of the room. There's that only few seconds that they are able to be there, and they're so apprehensive about the whole moment that very few of them actually even get a glimpse of the face that they are supposed to be getting a blessing from. And so it's just a kind of a very quick blessing. But so many times what I've noticed is they go in and they come out, and they seem to get more understanding in that one moment than years and years of words of telling the people have done. This happens with His Holiness also, the Karmapa, Jawan Karmapa, and those of you who've met, you know that he never spoke in English. He never gave large teachings, very short teachings if you were very fortunate. There was just the amazing sort of being able to be in his presence, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as well as many teachers are there where people don't have to be Buddhist, but they get it. They don't have to listen to something, they get it. They just are in the presence and they're able to get something that is beyond words, something that is beyond all these sort of reasonings and logic and so on. We try to subtract things and multiply things and divide things and analyze things, and yes, the certainty has to be there and so on and so forth. And then there are those moments where maybe things are being said in Tibetan, and you don't know a word of Tibetan, but you get it nevertheless. You get it by the most direct way of saying, yes, it's so simple to be kind. Yes, it's so simple to just let go. I think if you think about it in that way, that is what the Buddha's power is in those ways. So I don't think it necessarily means that he had that particular language that was understood by everyone, but it's just the immense sort of destruction of his own, all the negativities, and the great compassionate, selfless, compassionate, enlightened mind, that which is beyond words and beyond expressions, which enabled all forms of beings to understand what he was teaching, and the remarkable lucky ones, fortunate ones who were able to approach those teachings directly from him at that time. Nagas is said to, the Nagaraja or the king of the Nagas, or the Nagas are said to have ones who were there during the teachings that the Buddha taught, and then took the teachings and kept it with them. The later on is that in the human realm, schism, when it broke about, variations came about, as I said earlier. And it is said that when Nagarjuna looked for where the teachings were maintained in the correct form, was with the Nagas at that time. And so Nagarjuna said to have gone and gotten the Prajnaparamita teachings from the Nagas, and therefore became also known as the protectors of the Nagas, or Nagarjuna, his name itself came into being.
Would that be that the Prajnaparamita would be considered in the same classification as Dharma?
Some do say that. There are some people who do say that. But because it is from the words of the Buddha himself, it is still categorized as sutra. Okay?
Thank you very much.
We would like to call it, isn't it? I think the Vajrayanists wouldn't mind at all. Now, I don't know what my scholar friend would say to that. That I don't know at all, okay? So that's why some of the historians are there who do say that it isn't the direct teachings of the Buddha himself, but that it is a variation, a commentary on what the Buddha might have taught as the words that we have of the Heart Sutra today. So that's a sort of subject of dispute all the time. And so with all these different subjects, then the commentary, one of the well-known commentaries on the Nagarjuna's letter is called Pemakarpue Tengwa, or the garland of white flowers. Some say garland of white lotuses, or some say garland of white flowers, Nagarjuna's letter. So let's go a little bit into the text itself and sort of go through what the commentary says. Om Swati, Cherab Raldi Barves, Yuichi Kunmo Mumbi Tishin Chungchungne, Chenyi Shen Hawa Jinzapa, Lama Jamgan Mawe Sengechong, Tupsung Sabdan Jansu Kombedun, Chishin Telke Palgan Pabelu, Lekshe Shetin Chendra Bekarten, Lame Sunjin Peldi Gavelo, Dayang Papalu Jinzebi Shebeti Dini Chabala Tsenjidun Jurcha, Jundun Judun Jile, Damboni Jagarkedu, Surheda Leka Bökedu Shebite, Zawo Jawu Deju Shejawa, Musu Mateber Tingwena, Tingi Kosum. And so, as I said, the Nagarjuna's letter to the friend itself, classically, when texts are taught, it is taught by giving divisions and classifications of the chapters, so that being able to really have a good structured framework of the teachings facilitates the persons who are hearing it to have a much more sort of a structured approach to practicing and understanding the teachings. The Shepetingik, or the Nagarjuna's letter to a friend, in Sanskrit is called Surhida Lekha. In some of the English translations, I've seen the name Surhilekha written, which is spelled as Suhrilekha. I think in this also you have written Surhilekha. The traditional Tibetan text often refers to it as Surhid Lekha, and there's a D in it, Suhrid. There's a D added to it, Surhid Lekha. And so there is, of course, both of them are correct. In many times, the D is a very subtle sound that is not clearly pronounced, and therefore, maybe because of that, Surhilekha or Surhidalekha is the actual Sanskrit term name of the text itself. In Tibetan, it is called Shetin, Shetrin, Shetin, or Shetin, which simply means letter to a friend. And so the Sanskrit term itself, Surhidalekha, has much more enduring way of saying. If it was literally translated, it would almost be a heartfelt, endearing letter given to someone who's close to one's heart. And so in that way, the letter was written by Nagarjuna to his friend, the king, whose name was Dezangpo in Tibetan, and that is then written as, in phonetics, Dezangpo, DechhodZangpo, Dezangpo, or simply King Surabhibhadra is his Sanskrit name. And so the text itself is divided into the name, which we just went through, the sort of commentary on the name itself, explanation of the name itself. Second is the main part of the text is devoted to Juchak, which is a translator's homage. Then the third classification is Jungden, the actual text itself, the body of the text itself, and Jugden, which is the conclusion of the text. And so these are the main four classifications of the text. The first one, as we just went through, the names Surhidalekha in Sanskrit and Shepetiyik in Tibetan, or in English now, letter to a friend, Nagarjuna's letter to a friend. Second is then the homage of the masters and the translators to the mentioned in the text. Here it simply would say it is paying homage, the translator's homage to Manjushri Manjugosha himself. But again, for Buddhist scholars, it's always very helpful to be able to know, according to the homage, what category of text you are studying. And then knowing the category of this text, being able to relate to the view of the text. That's very, very necessary to keep in mind. Because even in teaching, sometimes these days we find the approach of Buddhism in the West is very good. On the other hand, it's a little bit haphazard. It's not very well structured. And so it's a very free style of teachings where people have jumped into Dzogchen or Mahamudra teachings, sometimes Mahayana teachings, sometimes this teaching, sometimes that teaching. And then there's a little bit of reluctancy to Vinaya teachings. So for some reason, the West has this whole attitude of don't tell us about discipline, don't tell us about moral conduct. These are not the most appetizing subject matters. And there's a sort of falling in love with a few subjects. One is space. They love the idea of space. Well, the other one is mindfulness. Then the compassion is very popular. And then, of course, emptiness is also a subject that is more close to your heart. Now, what happens is, although these are all depending upon how you receive it, depending upon how you are taught, they're all very helpful. But what does happen is a little bit of disorganized view comes in the mind of the people. So if you tell people to be ethically correct, for example, very oftentimes people will say, oh yeah, but everything is empty in nature. And you've gotten so many instructions on emptiness of phenomena and emptiness of self. You've gotten the instruction, but you've not really realized it. But one doesn't think that way. One thinks you've gotten the teachings and you know about a certain thing, and you let that go into different areas where it may be most important that you actually practice those teachings. And so when we say something such as let go, people very easily have very strong connection with it, and they say, I should let go. I know this, I should let go of anger, I should let go of attachment. But on the other hand, that letting go may be not really pure. That letting go may be very manipulative letting go, breeding laziness instead, or breeding non-awareness instead. And so instead of a genuine fruition of letting go, that letting go itself may be actually harboring your ego more, or actually protecting your own neurosis a lot more. These kind of situations happen when there is no clear understanding of the view that you are working with at this mind. And so we say, very conveniently, we switch from Vajrayana view to Mahayana view to Hinayana view, wherever it is convenient to us. And since the certainty of the view is not there, one doesn't realize the potential that you are working with at this moment. One doesn't understand the ground basis, the foundation that you are standing upon that needs to be transcended or transformed at this moment. So it's very important for meditators increasingly today, as you learn more about Buddha Dharma, to have correct understanding of a structured view so that the progressive stages of understanding is what you are truly taking to heart. Knowing that it does not, sometimes we say, when you begin from the basics, it doesn't mean you've been demoted in some ways. You know, I thought I was Vajrayanist, now I'm being told to come back to something else. Doesn't and shouldn't be taken as a demotion, but should be taken as a much more honest approach, because this whole system of training is based upon having the courage to realize absolute truth. And that truth cannot be realized if there is no honesty in the mind of the meditator. That truth has to be realized with honesty, and therefore to be honest with what ground you are standing upon is a much more realistic approach that will bring about greater and quicker fruition. And knowing that even if you discover that you are in the very lowest of the potential at the moment, knowing everything is impermanent, everything changes from this basis to a very higher state of realization doesn't need to take a long period of time. It isn't upon the duration of time, it is always dependent upon the courage of honesty, the courage of truthfulness, and how much you can really work with truthfulness within your own self. Therefore, it is said, homages itself relay the correct understanding of the view that one is working with. Homage identifies which stream of teachings you are receiving. And so here it says, Vinaya, if the teachings are connected to the Vinaya, homages are always made to the omniscient one, to the Buddha himself. If the homages are made to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, then it means that these are sutra teachings. If the homages are made to Manju Gosha or Manjushri, then it means that the teachings are connected to the science of mind and logic and reasoning and Abhidhamma form of teachings. And therefore, seeing the homage, a Buddhist meditator must immediately know, oh, this is a sutra teaching, or this is a Vinaya teaching, or this is an Abhidhamma teaching. That awareness must be there in the minds of the meditators at all times. This allows you to say, oh, this is a Vinaya teaching. It's going to teach about what to do, what not to do, what to abandon, what to cultivate. And the approach I must take here is to be able to really take the teachings as instructions, very direct instructions, without giving into sort of emptiness at this point, or what is the nature of sort of space and so on and so forth. And so knowing the structure and then being able to train accordingly allows the meditator or the mind of the meditator to reap the fruitioning of the teachings, the fruit of the teachings, much more clearly. Suhita Lekha, or the letter of Nagarjuna itself, is then beginning with homage to Manju Gosha or Manjushri himself. And therefore, immediately, it's all about, of course, it has all the different teachings that are there. It's a sutra or Vinaya, both are also Buddha's teachings, but mainly, since it is an Abhidhamma teaching, it is all about reasoning, examining within your own self. Punzun sobe yende jiranjin gewa tabe chue nyebe nödu hoba she pöne shon zabab lurup dagini yanji yanla tuju dan dembe dewar shebe sungi nyebe tene Rinpoche namle chungwe dön sung. Chimal tsigi gone kengba chungne dönji gone kengba chungwa nide pe jeta na deshe ji kuzu ju memba shing le chang jiba namba chue zang minje namba chue zang min chinra rungde kebe jiwar chue ba te jindu dagi nyanga te sigi chorwa sok ngena yang samu chu dön jobala tenle mebar mijite langwar chawishi tamba hoso. And so paying homage to Manjushri, Nagarjuna himself says over here, even if the words are the instructions of the Buddha, in expressing it, if it is not poetic, it should still be regarded as the words of the Buddha. And giving a beautiful example, it says, even if the material that is used to make the figure of the Buddha is not so valuable and it is made with ordinary wood, but because the ordinary wood is transformed into the statue of the Buddha, the form of the Buddha, it becomes an object of veneration. Likewise, even if the instructions are not in the best of the poetic ways, as I said, it's a very direct instruction, even if it is not very poetic, still knowing that these are fundamental basic teachings of the words of the Buddha, may it be recognized as being the teachings of the Buddha, an object of veneration and heart advices that should be emulated by those who hear the teachings. And especially here there is a particular example, and in the root text it's also given, is that an analogy of whitewashed building made more sparkling and beautiful when the moonlight arises and strikes the whitewash. And even the whitewash looks like marble, pure marble, where it begins to sparkle in a brightly moonlit night. Likewise, this example is given by Nagarjuna to the king himself, who is said to have been learned in Buddha Dharma. And so here is a way of saying, even if you know all these things, re-remember them all over again. Re-strengthen in your mind the instructions, recollect the teachings in your own mind, and telling the king over here, I know you know the teachings completely, but although it is like a whitewash, it is like simply sort of whitewashing a building, as you know, the moonlight sparkles and makes it so very beautiful. May these words that come to you from a friend illuminate the wisdom of the Buddha's words that you already hold in your heart to become even more radiant and more sparkle in your own mind. And in that way, as we hear the teachings, it becomes essential to really say this very clearly to one's own self. Is Buddhism, as I said earlier, isn't about knowing certain things. We can easily say, I know it is important to be kind unbiasedly to the others. But from the Buddhist practitioner's perspective, you do not know it until you do not do it. That's the thing. And so even if we say, we understand loving kindness to be important, but then you have to ask yourself and say, do I do it? If you are doing it, you know it. If you are not doing it, it's as good as not knowing it at all. Someone who doesn't know it at least has an excuse. Then we are worse off. We don't even have an excuse not to do it. And therefore, Dharma is to be practiced sincerely, very accurately. Today's times, I think, as I said earlier, lots of diligence, a lot of exertion, a lot of devotion to the path of practices, but always, and not only today's times, all the times, it is a human nature in that there's so much reluctancy to actually practice the Dharma completely. Where Dharma is not completely practiced, then hoping for the result will always be ironical in many ways. And so we Buddhists always say, well, what do we hope for? Is the exhaustion of suffering for self and the others. You have to look at your own nature, your own attitude and conduct and say, well, how many are there the actions that you are doing that resemble the aspiration of finding cessation to suffering for yourself and for other sentient beings? If the actual transformation and the transition of one's own actions and conduct and attitude is not happening simply by counting, may all sufferings be exhausted, may all be enlightened, by counting it in numbers, whether through mantras or through aspirations, isn't going to be beneficial at all. And so we have this various examples of people who sort of wait for something to happen and it doesn't happen. And I always say, if you have this glass of water in front of you and I'm dying of thirst and almost at the verge of sort of dying, and I keep saying, visualizing this glass of water going into my mouth and it will be pacifying my thirst and so on and so forth, until I make the effort of drinking the glass of water myself, keeping it in front of me isn't going to pacify the thirst at all. Dharma is like that. We have excellent shrines, we have excellent equipments, we have all the books, we have all our teachers, we have the pictures of our teachers, we fight over the lineages, mine is better than yours, all of these different things. They are not Dharma at all. They are entertainment in life. For a temporary moment, it feels like Dharma. Genuine Dharma is not about that. Genuine Dharma is through all these different objects that allow us to reflect upon the truth, that allow us to really understand what Buddha Dharma is, the connections with the teachings and the teachers that give us an understanding of the Dharma. Now, how much of the essence of that Dharma is actually emulated in my own attitude, in my own conduct, how much of it is manifest truly, how much of it is something that is permeating within my mind stream completely, that examination, until it is done, one is not actually practicing Buddha Dharma at all. And therefore here too, being able to take the following instructions of Nagarjuna in saying, may I truly examine within my own self and see how many of those teachings have I actually heard. And those who are hearing it for the first time, then knowing these should be emulated. Many of us who have actually heard about it before, examining now and saying, oh, in all these years of my practicing the Dharma, are these the qualities that are manifest in my actions? Why is it that I'm not able to manifest? If I am manifesting it, how strong is it? Being joyful in that you are practicing it, making it more strong. And then if you've forgotten it, saying, oh, this is a reminder. This is, again, bringing your own mind back to the right track of accomplishing the practices as it should be. And in the words of our great teachers saying, if you practice the Dharma as Dharma should be practiced, it truly leads to the cessation of suffering of yourself and other sentient beings. But if Dharma itself is not practiced accurately, correctly, then Dharma itself becomes the greatest deception of all. It is very easy to let go of the faults of samsara, but it's extremely difficult to see how we have misused Dharma, and therefore that manipulation of the Dharma itself becomes a cause that is very difficult to first identify. And even if one identifies, it has become such a sort of an object of grasping that we are so attached to that it's very difficult to uproot it, very difficult to discard. So for example, attachment to worldly material things is easy to give up. Attachment to teachings and attachment to practices and attachment to lineages, those are very difficult. Very few people will be brave enough to tell you that's an attachment in the first place because you're calling it devotion, isn't it? And therefore, since these spiritual words have been brought in, so it's very difficult to recognize that they have become itself another egos, another way of manipulating your own wisdom, your own sanity. And therefore, it is very essential to give birth to the clear and honest examination within one's own self, making sure that one is truly walking the path of practice honestly. Therefore, in the beginning of the text, I think the first 6 verses of the text are devoted to emulating what are called the 6 preliminary qualities that must be there in every meditator. Gangla thepar chawe shing sanje so jendren truk dor tempa tang jendren chima sum jepar shepa sum jesu trempa truk tempa sum. And so in Tibetan it says jesu trempa truk, or what are called 6 qualities that must be emulated by every meditators, or also called 6 things to keep in mind. And in the commentary text it says the first 4 that are explained briefly, and the latter 3 that are explained in a longer way or in a much more detailed commentary. These 6 things that should be kept in the mind of the meditator are called, as a verse it is said, Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha are the first 3 things that should be kept in the mind. Generosity is the 4th, ethical conduct is the 5th, and then following the examples is called the 6th. In some of the English translations that I remember, this is explained in various different ways. Classical Tibetan text, the commentary itself here says, if this line is translated directly as it is given, it'll read something like this. It's a very loose translation, but following the examples as well as the aspirations of the devas or the celestial beings. And very often I've seen people get a little bit confused, especially the Western students become a little bit confused over here. The way to relate to this last example, although is in the end, however, in short here as we see it is, I think very crucial. It is referring to being very honest and realistic in your approach to Dharma. What is it that you really hope to obtain from Buddha Dharma? And then knowing the fruit, working in accordance to the fruit. For example, the very simple classical example, if you want a sort of a mango fruit to grow, you plant a mango seed, isn't it? The same example here is, if you want happiness, make sure you're planting the seed of happiness. If you want emptiness, make sure you're planting the seed of emptiness. If you want enlightenment, make sure you're planting the seed of enlightenment. Don't let it be that you plant the seed of really fruit that you want is happiness. Therefore, you plant the seed of happiness, but then when it comes to a small sprouting up and your neighbor asks you, what seed did you put? You say, I put the seed of emptiness, isn't it? And that is because you're too embarrassed to say, I asked for happiness. And so you're going to pretend that this is emptiness that we want. So this is a very important example here that I think in the text is where if you are looking for relative happiness, be brave enough to say, I aspire for relative happiness. Don't pretend and say, we all want the absolute truth. But secretly, there is always the effort to gain the relative happiness. In that if you want to be very wealthy, and that's why you are praying to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, be very honest, say, I'm practicing meditation so that I can have a long life, I can find a good partner, I can actually be happy, I can have peacefulness of mind, I can be materially wealthy, and so on and so forth. It's very important that the meditator recognizes the ground that you stand upon, the potential and the sort of capacity of aspiration that your mind has, being free from guilt of thinking, oh, I have such a relative materialistic aspiration, being free of that guilt, knowing that recognizing itself allows you to make it better. Worse is when you don't know what potential it is, what your actual aspiration is, and you force yourself to pretend otherwise, is a much worse situation. When we discover in our own mind that the main reason why we practice the Dharma is for our own individual happiness and freedom from suffering, yes, we've been saying all sentient beings, that's very good, but actually it is about my own self. It gives you such a direct understanding of your own mind at this moment, which is the best wisdom in your own self. And that wisdom allows you to sort of say, this is not good, make it better, and bring forward the change. And so knowing that it has always the possibility of changing, you can always let it go, develop it into further. Therefore, the guilt of discovering a lower potential and an aspiration is not necessary. In the context of this sixth quality that is given here, it simply says, therefore, following the examples of all the devas as well as whoever different kinds of sentient beings are there who have been honest and in their honesty have practiced the Dharma in order to obtain the happiness and the causes of happiness that they have desired. In, again, coming back to the enumeration of the six, every meditator must therefore cultivate these six qualities in one's own mind, beginning from the first, which says, Sanje Dhunyir Hundrupa. One must always keep in mind the Buddha. What does the Buddha mean? The first one here, the text says, Buddha, the one who accomplishes the wish of self and others. And so what does Buddhahood mean? First of all, a meditator must always make sure, examine within one's own self and see how much true refuge do you actually take into the Buddha. Always see. Sporadically, as we wake up and we say, I take refuge into the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, do we do it in that very impersonal way? Do we do it in a way that is so very full of carelessness without really understanding their quality? Or do I take refuge with the full understanding of what the Buddha actually means? The outer Buddha was the perfect example that I wish to emulate, perfect example of somebody who has this immense quality of accomplishing the wishes of self and others. The inherent Buddha, my own Buddha nature, my own primordial nature of my mind, which is indivisible from this outer Buddha. Becoming the outer Buddha cannot be until I recognize my own inherent Buddha. This own inherent Buddha, that is the true nature of my mind, is expressed and recognized through the teachings of this outer Buddha. So the outer and the inner Buddha being inseparable from one another, into that I truly take a refuge. What does refuge mean? Refuge is taking protection, seeking protection. Seeking protection here is a mind grasping to the self and others, taking protection, taking refuge into the epitome of that example that accomplishes the wishes of self and the others. So then, if I am taking refuge into the Dharma, into the Buddha, the example of one who accomplishes the wishes of the self and others, how much do I actually then exert effort into emulating the example of the Buddha? What good is taking refuge if you cannot actually, having taken refuge, follow the example of that you are so devoted to and really wish to emulate? And therefore, in my mind, how much do I take an effort, make an effort in accomplishing the wishes of self and others? Upon becoming a Buddha, may I be able to really accomplish the wishes of self and others. And until that full enlightenment is not been achieved, may I make small attempts, but those that will gradually build up to following the example of the complete enlightened one, and therefore examining. The first is examining in your own self and seeing every day how much do you work hard in trying to accomplish Buddhahood by really doing as much for the others as much as you do for yourself. Yes.
Thank you for taking my question. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of having a personal relationship with a guru in terms of emulating the Buddha and putting your best step forward?
I think it's very important, I think. different ways to look at it. One is, in today's times, one of the very important aspects of connecting to a teacher is in being able to receive transmissions and teachings. We say inherently all that is taught within Buddha Dharma is not new. It is something that you already innately know. It's only just sort of waking it up and making you more aware of it in so many words. And that's the activity of the teacher. But even so, for that waking up or to be able to tell our own self, oh yes, this is true, this is what I have known, we need to rely upon a spiritual master. And so there are different ways to approach it. Probably from a Yana perspective also, first relationship to a teacher as of the Hinayanists is always of an elder, someone to follow the example of. An elder person who's a living example, an elder person who has done it, an elder person who gives you the teachings and are able to retain the purity of the lineage. That's the first. And therefore, from the Hinayana perspective, the teachers is always regarded as arhats, or the elders. And therefore, I think the term they use is thera. And so the thera is the term to a teacher. Mahayanists' approach to a teacher is called a kalyan mitra, or someone who thinks of the well-being of yourself. And so as a Mahayanist, we relate to a teacher as somebody whom you can rely upon, and in the English term, we use the term spiritual friends. So the spiritual friend, someone who guides you, someone who supports you, who protects you, who reminds you, who's always there for you. So the relationship that you have with a teacher is almost as of a friend, a very good friend, an honest friend whom you can trust upon. Vajrayanas, and the emphasis of Vajrayana, especially within the Mahamudra teaching, is of a complete guru. So the term guru is applicable more from the Vajrayana perspective. And therefore, in this context, you surrender completely to the guru. And the Vajrayanists believe that the inner refuge is guru devotion. So therefore, from the teachings perspective, we say outer guru is Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha. Inner guru is the root teacher. Secret guru is view, meditation, and action. And the ultimate guru is the ground, path, and fruition. That's the four ways of categorizing the teachings, or the teacher itself. Now, these are all sort of more the scholastic or technical ways of going about. To have a teacher first as someone to follow an example, I think is very good, like the Hinayanists do. Then there are many teachers that you have to rely upon who give you good advice, spiritual friends. Kalyan Mitra is very important. Now, as you progress into the Dharma, then transmissions and teachings become very essential. So then you begin to have a guru per se. The Vajrayana guru and guru devotion comes into being. At that, until those moments, it's all about how to benefit from this relationship in terms of getting the teachings. Ultimate guru would be someone who points out to you, we say nature of mind, but prior to nature of mind, I would say a guru is someone whom you can trust completely, and the teacher trusts you completely, brave enough, both of them brave enough to point out each other's faults and qualities very directly. When the heart really connects with one another, the teacher and the students, there is a sense of absolute trust. Founded upon that trust, the more fundamental nature of mind, or the more pith instructions can then be given by the teacher. And in that regard, having a root teacher, having one teacher that you absolutely trust completely, becomes very essential. As I was saying earlier, then in today's times, I think people are very fortunate in that they can relate to many, many teachers. But it is essential to have a very close teacher if you are somebody who cannot train oneself. If you think you can really train yourself, without faltering or being manipulative with the teachings, then I don't know, I think you can get by without so many teachers. But if a person feels that reminder and that strictness is needed, teachers become very essential. And when it comes to Tantra and the transmissions of the Tantra, having a teacher is absolutely important. So there are different levels. So if you think you're studying Hinayana, it's not that urgent. You have many elders that you can just relate to. It's not a very close relationship. In Mahayana also, it's much more the spiritual friend, so you can have a much more friendliness with the teachers, and that's quite all right. When it gets to Vajrayana, you must have a teacher. It's all about then the trust and being able to work with your trust, and therefore the devotion takes on a completely different meaning. So if it is from the Vajrayanist perspective, I would say a teacher is very important. Okay?
Great, thank you.
Yes. I think people are scratching their heads. I think. So the first of the qualities then is then being able to really examine and seeing whether one is able to really accomplish the self and others, and in your own mind, how much of the refuge to the Buddha are you taking, and are you actually keeping in mind the essence of the Buddha. The second is said to be the Dharma. The second thing that needs to be kept in the mind of a meditator to become a suitable vessel within which the teachings can truly and purely manifest is to then see or examine how much refuge into the Dharma is in your own mind stream. Am I really taking refuge into the Dharma? What does the Dharma actually mean? And so Nagarjuna here, it says, Dharma simply means the presentation or the reflection of the undiluted or the very pure form of the true truth. And so how much an awareness of the true truth are there in your own mind? Relative truth is how much as a meditator am I able to see and appreciate relative truth, things as they appear to be as to us. How much of an honest relationship do you have with relative experiences? Likewise, as a Buddhist meditator, how much am I devoted to the Dharma also means how much, while relating to the relative truth, inseparable from that relationship is my understanding of the fundamental truth or the absolute truth. Absolute truth, the definition of relative truth is things as they appear. A simple definition of absolute truth is things as they are, truly. Both of them are not separate of one another, not a contradiction of one another at all. Everything as it appears is true. On the other hand, as they appear, has a fundamental nature, a nature of suchness that must also be totally appreciated. So as a Buddhist meditator, how much is my mind able to take refuge into the Dharma must be understood as how much am I able to relate to all relative truth without separating it from its fundamental nature? Am I looking at everything that is around me with a deepened sense of inseparable appreciation of the compositeness of everything? Things as they appear, but in a bigger vision, being able to say there is much more than what they appear to be. Sound, when I hear, being able to hear the sound, but at the same time, is my mind capable of truly being appreciative of all different factors that go into the creation of the sound. It is not only what is apparent, but there is much more to and beyond what is just apparent into being what is really a compositeness of all the sounds. In all the thoughts and the feelings and the emotions that are being generated, knowing what they are, knowing happiness, knowing suffering, but at the same time is my mind, having taken in refuge into the Dharma, able to go beyond just the apparentness of the happiness or the painful thoughts into seeing the compositeness of all those things that lessen the impact of the relativity by broadening and understanding the many factors of the absolute that are there in the apparent relative truth. And so in that way, how much is my mind able to balance or unify the true truth at all times? If this is something that a meditator is capable of doing, then one is able to understand, relate to, appreciate everything that is a phenomenal display, and at the same time be totally free from getting entangled in the way that a person who distances oneself from the absolute truth happens to be. And so that is where we take everything only by what it is. A good form, a bad form. We make our judgments very quickly. Nice sound, bad sound. We make our judgments very quickly. good thought, bad thought, we make our judgments very quickly. These quick judgments come when there is no understanding of the compositeness, the absolute truth behind all the relative appearances that are there. When the mind is a little bit aware of the absolute truth, indivisible from the relative truth, it is able to say, all forms are very good, but there are so many factors that go into making it good. Therefore, there is not one that needs to be appreciated, there is a wholeness that needs to be appreciated. If there is something that the form appears to be ugly or not good, then again, yes, but then no one can be blamed for it. There are so many different factors, including the perceiver, that has to be included within that, and therefore the stark, strong opinion and the judgments are lessened out, whether of the good factors or whether of the negative factors. Thoughts also are the same as, yes, sir, this is a good thought, this is a bad thought. Recognizing and being able to have an opinion is fine, but the entanglement of then becoming very sticky and very sort of stuck, that doesn't happen, because one thinks, oh yes, but then there's a whole factor to it. There is the mistake of the hearer, the mistake of the perceiver, the mistake of those who grasp to it, what is the reality of it. Knowing things as they truly are lessens the impact, and therefore in that lessening of the impact, strong attachment is reduced, strong aversion is also reduced. And therefore, in taking refuge into the Dharma, mind of a meditator must always examine and see how much lessened attachment is there, how much lessened aversion is there, how much lessened partiality and bias is happening in your own mind. If the bias, the partiality, the aversion, and the attachment, all of them are lessening, without your saying in so many words, I take refuge into the Dharma, you are taking refuge into the Dharma. But if you're always bumping your head on the floor, I take refuge into the Dharma, I take refuge into the Dharma, and yet the mind itself is not reducing the aversion and the attachment because of not knowing the relative truth and the absolute truth, then realize that there is some work to be done in the mind of the meditator. Sangha, gendun ne rigdol nite. And so the Sangha is defined by Nagarjuna here as inseparable quality of awareness and liberation, knowing and yet not being attached, knowing and yet not being grasping, not grasping to what one knows. Rigdol is the term over here called, and so Rigpa and Drolwa, and so this is said to be someone who knows or is aware and at the same time liberated in that knowing, liberated within that moment of awareness. And so, in simple words, someone who is aware of the absolute truth. And so therefore, I am aware, and within that moment of awareness finds liberation. Knowing things as they are, being aware of things as they are, reducing unnecessary attachment, unnecessary aversion, unnecessary arrogance, unnecessary ignorance, unnecessary hatred, unnecessary bias and partiality, and therefore being able to genuinely have a sense of awareness. And so meditators these days say, my practice is mindfulness practices, isn't it? Many of you say that. What do you do normally? Oh, I don't do much kind of meditation. My practice has mainly been shamatha and mindfulness practices. I hear many people say that. And so I always wonder, what do you mean by mindfulness practices? If your mindfulness practices is always being mindful of everything that you shouldn't be doing, then it's not mindfulness practices. You know, I'm mindful of this anger, being angry. Oh, I'm mindful of having been angry. And then, you know, grasping and then say, oh, I'm mindful of my grasping mind, and you fully act out that grasping. I am mindful of having fully acted out my neurosis. You know. Now, if you call that kind of mindfulness practice, it is inaccurate. So Sangha here means not only someone who is aware, but within that awareness liberates all the root poisons. Because of that awareness, liberates yourself from the habit of anger, habit of desire, habit of ignorance, habit of hatred, habit of jealousy, and so forth. And so in that awareness, where you are able to truly liberate yourself from the habits or habitual tendencies and neurosis, that is then said to be truly taking refuge into the Sangha. And so therefore, the first three things that a meditator needs to keep in mind are said to be these three things. And so I think I can stop here for the first break, and then continue and see how much we can cover. Okay? Yes.
I have a misunderstanding of the Sangha from your description. I formerly thought that the Sangha were all of the people who were practicing Buddhism and the teachers
That's
that
a
came
very,
before.
like the teacher term. This is good to discuss. That's why is you cover many subjects together with it. Like the teacher term, Sangha term is also varied. People, when they say, I take refuge into the Sangha, many people think they're taking refuge into this. This is not worthy of taking refuge at the moment, no matter, on a good day we can say, yes, we are all very worthy of being taken refuge into, but that's not what is meant. When you take refuge for the first time, you take refuge into the Sangha of Bodhisattvas who have walked the path after the Buddha and have lived up to the qualities of being a Bodhisattva, someone who's really emulated the qualities of the Tathagata himself. You take refuge into the Bodhisattvas, not the normal Sangha here at all. However, again, from the Hinayana's perspective, this is the Sangha, and particularly the Sangha of Arahats and elders, the elders. From the Mahayana perspective, it is the Sangha of Bodhisattvas that we take refuge into. From the Vajrayana perspective, you take refuge into everyone who has the Buddha nature, and that is then pretty much everybody else. But at the same time, it doesn't mean the physical body itself. It takes into the enlightened mind that is there within the minds of all individuals. Okay? That kind of makes us feel all very happy. Now you're taking, we place ourselves among the third jewels. There's nothing wrong about it, but then you have to deserve being there.